much, Madam Chair, and it's a pleasure to contribute to the debate with you overseeing it, and I thank the Honourable Member for Ipswich for securing it, and I certainly join with him in paying tribute to the work of his colleague, the Honourable Member for Stevenage, throughout this entire debacle. I've seen his previous comments on Twitter and elsewhere on St Francis Tower, and I think it's an issue that he's right to highlight, because many of our constituents will be facing similar problems, as he says, as this crisis reaches the next stage. He describes it as a precursor, and he's right. And I've made, as he has, and Stevenage and others, representations on behalf of many constituents in buildings affected by the scandal. And part of the scandal is that we are still so far off remediation for the vast majority of them. But for those who are at that stage, there are real problems of the sort that he describes. I have recently been in touch with leaseholders in Mandale House in my constituency in the heart of Sheffield. And they're in exactly that position. And it comes after all the other traumas that they've faced. The uncertainty over so long, the waking watch costs, their trebling of insurance costs. They're now facing the problems of the actual remediation work. Their building is to be clad, understandably and necessarily, in scaffolding. That requires the removal of balconies, in their case. And as he said, and we all know through this recent period that any piece of outdoor space is precious to people. So losing a balcony in itself is bad enough, but the work also involves blocking the window where the balcony is. And for many of those flats, it's the only window in their flat. So people are being condemned to live in a space with no source of light, no source of natural light, and no ventilation. And they anticipate that they're going to be in that position for 2.5 years. But as we know, it could be longer, given the way these things unfortunately go. At Mandale House, as in other buildings who are facing the situation, they're going to lose access to their car park, which, small by comparison, but in city centre complexes, having somewhere to park cars is actually quite important. They paid for that space. And there's no sense of what alternative provision might be available. They're going to have to pay for it. There's all the issues of people coming back late at night, young women walking through the city when they'd rather park in their building and access their flats directly. So there are a range of problems, and in any other situation where people were facing these sort of difficulties, you would have somebody to turn to for compensation, or perhaps to facilitate relocation during the work taking place. But there's nothing of that available to them. And for those who might want to move temporarily, their flat's going to be unrentable. For those who might want to be moving on with their lives, which we know is a big aspect of this crisis, their flat is also unrentable. So not only is this remediation work impacting on them directly in terms of the way they live, it's also going to be impacting on them in the way that they can take their lives forward. Now, it just adds, as the Honourable Member has suggested, to the stress that's been faced by many leaseholders over such a long period of time, anticipating the difficulties that they're going to face, living without access to balconies, no source of natural light, no source of natural ventilation. And although they recognise that this is necessary work, vital as he described it, effectively they're being asked to pay substantially money to repair faults for which they have no responsibility, in order to enjoy a substantial reduction in the quality of their lives over a very long period. I mean, it is obscene what's happening to them, and it's having a very significant impact on their mental health, as the Honourable Member has pointed out. And as I say, for people who have already been traumatised. It's an issue, the impact on mental health, that's been explored in a report by Jenny Preece of the University of Sheffield, who also works with the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, which they published at the end of last year on living through the building safety crisis. Dr. Preece started her research before many leaseholders were starting to make payments or to face the impact of remedial work. But they were, at that stage, facing all the other worries, having to dig out for Waking Watch. Mandale House, they had to pay substantially for the new alarm system. Paying for interim measures while still uncertain about their future. And it has to be said that for most of these people, the government's recent proposals won't lift the worries. Many leaseholders have had their whole lives taken over by this crisis. One who's involved in organising across the city is a GP. It has completely defected his career development because he's become almost a full-time organiser to raise the voices of those who are suffering these injustices. Dr. Preece's report points out the sort of practical impact of the worries that many people are facing, of leaseholders who have a bag packed by their front door in case they have to move out in a hurry because their building reaches that point of unsafety, a lack of safety. And it's a real worry. I mean, I had another building on Wicker Riverside, which was evacuated before Christmas 2020 at 3 hours' notice. So these are real worries. But the continued lack of support from the government has meant that the financial worry has overtaken the question of safety for most leaseholders, and that came through very powerfully in Dr. Preece's report. From her extensive interviews with leaseholders, she concludes the negative impact on mental well-being ranged from constant worry and inability to concentrate and focus on work to anxiety, depression and suicidal feelings. And I've had one mother write to me talking about her son was seriously contemplating suicide because he'd felt so blocked in by the crisis imposed on him. There's a real fear of a dangerous fire breaking out, but that, as I say, is eclipsed by financial impact. The anticipation or receipt of bills which are simply unaffordable without breaking people financially has created enormous stress, alongside the day-to-day attrition of increasing costs on insurance, on Waking Watch, on other things. All of the participants in Dr. Preece's survey reflected on the impact of their ability to control their own lives. And that's worth kind of reflecting on for a moment, their inability to control their lives and plan for their future. You know, many of them are young people at the start of life, planning careers, planning families, unable to move, unable to commit to having an extra member of the family in the household. And that's been particularly important for all those life stage transitions. As I say, family planning, moving to a larger home, retirement, and some of these are people who have invested savings into a retirement plan and are trapped similarly. Those pressures have challenged, for many of them, their self-perception and their self-confidence, and it's put a strain on relationships. And yet, I don't want to score a party political point here because there's been a lot of cross-party unity on these. The Prime Minister was recently asked on ITV about these concerns that were expressed by one of my constituents in Wicker Riverside, Jenny Garrett. And he said, quote, that she had a, quote, frankly unnecessary sense of anxiety. Now, I challenged him on that at PMQs and asked him to meet Jenny to explain why she and so many others were worried in the way that they were. And I have to say I was surprised by his response, because he doubled down on that assertion and told me that it was my responsibility to tell her that her building was safe. Now that's shocking, but it's perhaps an insight into why the government is still failing to treat the issue with the urgency it deserves and in the appropriate way, because although I recognise that the recent announcement was a step forward, it doesn't address the commitment that the Prime Minister had previously made, and the one that we should be committed to as parliamentarians, because these are people who've faced an extraordinary injustice. What we should be doing, because the solution the government's proposing will lead a long road to resolution for many of the people who are affected by the scandal, heaping more worry, potential litigation they won't be able to afford or organise. What we should be doing is taking responsibility for fixing the buildings quickly and then using the full resources of the state to hold those responsible for account and to recover the public money that we need to put in to secure that, so that we can live up to that commitment that at one stage the Prime Minister made, that every affected building is fixed and without delay and at no cost to leaseholders. That will lift their worry.